Hi everyone, welcome to this week's episode of Archetypes in the News for February 19th, 2018. And this week we will discuss Donald Trump's natal chart and the Russian indictments that came out this weekend. I would like to say, just to begin with, that I am going to refrain from my typical stance in trying to be neutral and refrain from having my bias be shown in my astrological analysis. And the reason I'm doing this is particularly because I believe Donald Trump honestly is gaslighting America, and I do not believe it is responsible for me to not speak the truth as I see it, or to say it a better way, it is my responsibility, is the way I see it, to say the truth as I see it, and not to hold back with ambiguous and possible interpretations of the way that the archetypes are coming through. I'm going to describe the way I see it coming through, and if anyone disagrees, please post comments below, or if you'd like to post your own interpretation of the way you see the archetypes coming through, I would love to see that. And I believe ultimately that it is a dialogue and discursive practice that through this type of analysis that we will actually come to a consensus understanding of what the truth actually is. But as of now, Donald Trump, I believe, is a pathological liar and is gaslighting America and is throwing our ability to assess the truth into a very marginalized position. And I believe, like I said, it's my responsibility, or anyone's responsibility, to actually say what we see is actually taking place. And I think it's actually deeply important at this moment in history. So let's begin. For those of you who may be new to astrology, or for those of you who are not, and wonder why astrology should work and how it fits into our worldview, well, the worldview that we are taught in the highest academic accredited schools today is one that of Big Bang, and that the evolution of the universe is a random process, and that it somehow through Darwinian evolution and random mutation accidentally created a highly intelligent, meaning-seeking species, us, out of a meaningless cosmos. So the universe itself is meaningless, without intelligence or purpose, but somehow it randomly, accidentally created a highly intelligent, highly meaning-seeking species. Does this make any sense to you? Me neither, and I believe it is an absurd hypothesis, but yet it is the prevailing worldview in our highest academic accredited institutions. So we have to start from that beginning and move outward, and I believe that the astrological perspective is actually evidence of a meaningful cosmos. Not only a meaningful cosmos, but a meaningful cosmos that wants us to be here and wants us to have a relationship with the larger cosmos itself, and recognize how we are embedded participants, not separate observers of phenomena of the world itself. We are an embedded part of nature, an expression of the universe itself, ultimately an expression of the creative intelligence itself in the universe that happens to be reflected in the movements of the planets related to the human psyche. So that's the basic premise for why this works, and I think it's a good place for us to start. So in addition to how I feel it is my responsibility to speak the truth as I see it with Donald Trump and his chart and his transits, there's another reason why I feel a little more confident to make some predictions, actually, as to what's going on. And the reason is specifically because I believe Donald Trump represents a large part of what the white European American male psyche or being needs to overcome in order to survive. He represents the shadow dimension of the white European hubris and superiority complex that has dominated Western civilization for the past 500 years. And in an extreme, he's an extreme example, hyperbolic. I don't believe that he is ever engaged in a self-reflective practice, or even just times of self-reflection on some level. Because I mean, I remember when he was asked on the campaign trail by an evangelical voter, he said, Donald Trump, have you ever asked for forgiveness? And Donald Trump said no, that he didn't feel as though he had ever done anything that needed to be forgiven. So I'm paraphrasing. I don't know the exact quotes there, but it's something along those lines. And the point is that he doesn't see his own shadow. And so what is happening there is he's projecting that. He's projecting his own shadow onto the other, what he sees as other, onto everyone outside of himself, onto the world at large, onto all of America. And this is a big problem. And again, what I believe is happening is a giant transformation that all of humanity is on the verge of going through. And I believe we need to overcome a large part of what he represents in order to survive. Most specifically, his divisiveness. He sees himself as separate from everyone else and other, and he objectifies everything. He objectifies women very specifically, and you can see it in the language that he uses. Like when he was describing Andrew McCabe's wife receiving $500,000 in a Senate campaign in Virginia from Terry McAuliffe, a Clinton friend, he said that the wife, he called her the wife, took the money. And he's done it on other occasions. I've heard him say the wife as is a possession in his mind. And he does, obviously, seems to see them that way. And so this is what I believe humanity needs to transcend in order to survive. It's this idea that we're separate from each other, that we're separate from the world, that we're separate from the cosmos at large. And thankfully, quantum mechanics says that we're not separate, that the universe is a field of energy. We are a part of an inseparable field, and archetypal astrology does the same thing on the macro scale. We are not separate from the largest patterns in nature that we are aware of, the planetary cycles. We are deeply connected to them. They reflect in specific detail the interiority, the precious, deep interiority of our being, of our psyche. So there is a commensurate relationship between what seems to be far away and what is deeply inside. And this represents the interconnectedness of all things. And this is something that we need to recognize in order to survive on planet Earth. It seems to me as though a large part of our problem comes from this idea of a subject-object division, that we are separate subjects and the world is an object to be utilized to our benefit. And rather than seeing ourselves as participants within a web of nature that we are dependent upon and need to find a harmonious relationship with, rather than determining by our own egoic rationality the way that the world should be. Okay, so now let's get into the astrology. Okay, so this is Donald Trump's natal chart, and we'll just start with the sun and the moon. He's born with the sun conjunct Uranus, and this is the part of him that's very erratic and unpredictable. Uranus is sudden, unexpected, and novel. It's the change agent, and he certainly is a change agent, and he is certainly unpredictable in its shadow side. Uranus also relates to genius and breakthrough and emancipation and rebirth. So who knows? He's definitely got his level of genius, but he's also highly ignorant in lots of ways. So then I'd also like to point out that he's born at or during a lunar eclipse or just prior to a lunar eclipse, which is interesting because the moon represents the relational field and the other people, and he doesn't seem to have that deep of a connection with the other at all. He seems to lack a lot of empathy surrounding the other. He's also born with the sun in this tight trine to the planet Jupiter, which is good fortune and success and upliftment. And in his case, this is the hubris, this is the arrogance, this is the entitlement, this is the superiority complex. It's the shadow form of Jupiter, is inflation. Too much of a good thing. It is success, it is good fortune, and which he definitely has had, but it's also in its shadow form arrogance and hubris and superiority complex, which he definitely demonstrates. He also is born with a Mars rising, that's that kind of fiery, assertive rhetoric and kind of combative nature that he has, but it's empowered because of Pluto and Saturn create a midpoint alignment. Pluto happens to be the exact midpoint of Mars and of Saturn. And so it's not just Mars that's like aggressive and assertive, it's got a depth to it, an intensity, and a reactionary kind of combativeness that wants to hit back immediately. You see with Mars Saturn the tendency to assert and then meet resistance, and so like when he feels attacked, he reacts and hits back quick. He's a fighter. He's always come across and said that he's a fighter, and you can see that often in Mars Saturn Pluto complexes and alignments. And then specifically, he's born with Mercury, the mind, the way one thinks, the way one communicates, in a square, a hard, challenging aspect, 90 degrees, to the planet Neptune, which is the stream and flow of consciousness. It's our imagination. It's our dreams. It's reality that transcends the consensus reality. Saturn is the consensus reality. Saturn is reality that everyone agrees upon, the physical structure of things. Neptune is a reality that is transcendent. It is consciousness. It's love. It's the things that are ethereal, that aren't necessarily easy to pin down. So in his case, Mercury, his mind, and Neptune are in a challenging relationship, but he tends to embody this in a way that has a really difficult time nailing down the truth or sticking to the truth, staying with the consensus reality or staying with a logical kind of structure of things. He seems to say things and then believe his own rhetoric, believe his own imagination, and kind of he seems to just double down on that over and over again. And I'd like to point out something here, too, that this is the dwarf planet Eris, which was discovered in 2003, and it is why Pluto was briefly declassified as a planet, because it's larger than Pluto, and it is way outside of her orbit. And so, anyway, long story, but the archetypal nature of Eris is that she's the goddess of strife and discord. And it is in a square alignment, 90 degrees, to his natal Mercury, and in the opposition to Neptune. And we don't have a lot of research on Eris. It's so new, and we just don't have a lot of data, but it definitely seems to fit in his situation, where his Mercury and Neptune has this like challenging relationship with the goddess of strife and chaos. And wow, does he seem to actually really embody that in a mercurial way with all the tweets. It's just chaos, chaos, chaos. And it's almost like I said before, gaslighting. It's like he's trying to disorient all of us and make us believe that our reality isn't actually the way we think it is, by repeating lies over and over again and denying the truth, which is part of what gaslighting is. So this is, kind of the big parts of his natal chart. He also has this Venus-Saturn conjunction, which is, I think, part of the objectification of women, the feminine, or objectification of values. It's like anything that he values, Venus, is objectified. It's something that should just be understood as a possession or something to be utilized. So that's the basics of his natal chart. And I'd like to point out that this is Robert Muller's birth chart on the outside, and this is Donald Trump's birth chart on the inside. And it's quite fascinating to me that Robert Muller's Saturn is right on Donald Trump's Mercury, square to his natal Neptune and Eris. But what's fascinating about this is Saturn is karma and the consequences of one's actions, and it's also the authority in life. The authority is in the authority structures, but in this case, someone who has an authoritative position of with Donald Trump in the sense of specifically striving to have him tell the truth. Saturn is the truth in the sense that it's consensus reality, what we agree upon is true, and Mercury is his mind and the way he thinks. And so he is ultimately going to have to prove his perspective on things to Robert Mueller, or we're going to be in a constitutional crisis, which is probably where we're headed, in my opinion. So now we're going to take a look at the Russian indictments this weekend. And so again, this is Donald Trump's natal chart on the inside, and this is the position of the planets this weekend. And I'm going to jump back real quick. The eclipse back in August, remember the eclipse took place on his Mars, and it was just a week after the Charlottesville incident. And I talked about that in the first episode. And I'd like to point out that we just on the 15th had another, the polar opposite, the 6 month later lunar solar eclipse that again was opposite Donald Trump's Mars. And so that's just this last week and the day before the indictments were released. And what's interesting about it is that when the indictments were released, Donald Trump's first tweet actually was somewhat supportive of the findings because he wasn't personally indicted, or anyone in his campaign was not said to be a witting participant. They were said to be unwitting participants. And what's interesting about it is that on Saturday morning and Sunday morning, he, I think, began to realize that it wasn't as favorable for him as he had believed. And he sent out a series of 13 tweets, interestingly, that were all highly critical of the release, and he never addressed the fact that the Russians had actually meddled in our election and had said nothing about wanting to fight this situation or bring more sanctions or anything to any type of results or consequences for the Russians' actions to disrupt our election. Which is fascinating because one of his tweets, he blames Obama for not doing more while he was still in office, but yet he has taken no responsibility and has set forth no step to do anything about the meddling that he now, I guess, says that took place. So another thing I think we can say about what's taking place here is that Saturn is moving into a tight opposition to Donald Trump's natal Mercury and square to his natal Neptune. But the Saturn opposite Mercury, this is, I believe, what is Saturn represents consensus reality and the truth and consequences of our actions and karma and integrity. It has to do with integrity. And Donald Trump lacks a serious amount of integrity. And he, I believe, is a pathological liar. And it is hard for me to see that he could go through this transit. Here, I'm going to animate this chart and show you what's going to happen. I'm going to move it in the course of weeks, and we can watch Saturn move down here as this happens. So Saturn's going to move up to 9, and then it's going to station and move backwards to 2. And then it stations there. This is in August of 2018, just before the elections. And then it crosses back across his natal Mercury by December of 2018, just after the elections. And it is hard for me to see how someone with the lack of integrity, the lack of being able to stick to a logical narrative, a truth, and that is that I believe that the consequences of his actions and decisions are going to come home to roost. That they are going to be called out by the consensus, by us, by Robert Muller with his Saturn on Donald Trump's Mercury. These alignments seem to speak of someone being held accountable for the truth, and it's just hard for me to see someone that lacks such integrity and an ability to see his own shadow, that he could somehow navigate out of this. One way that we can describe what's happening with Donald Trump is in two ways. He is either guilty or he is so ignorant that he behaves in a way that he doesn't realize that he acts as though he is guilty. Either of these two scenarios, whether he's guilty or so ignorant that he doesn't recognize his behavior, either one are disqualifying, in my mind, to be president. If you don't have the psychological wherewithal to know when you are lying or not, you should obviously not be the president. So this is where I stand. I'm not going to mince my words anymore. I don't believe that we are in a position that we can allow this to happen. And so I'm going to stand up as I have today and continue to speak the way I see things. And please feel free to disagree, leave your comments below, and I look forward to responding to them. So I hope everyone's doing well, having a great week, and we'll talk again soon. Okay, take care.